few years ago, I had the opportunity to work with a high school basketball team whose roster was made up almost entirely of sophomores and juniors. The coach asked me to come speak with the team before their state playoffs about dealing with pressure, or to use constructs popular in the sports psychology literature, stress, arousal, and anxiety. Stress, arousal, and anxiety are closely related, sometimes overlapping constructs, which is kind of a problem for research and statistical analyses. Spielberger's 1989 definition stipulates that stress refers to a complex psychobiological process composed of a stressor and an emotional reaction. Stress can be a terrible thing. Negative stressful events like losing a job or a loved one involve distress. The word stress obviously has negative connotations, but stress can also be a wonderful thing. Stressful events that are interpreted positively involve eustress. If you were to ask older adults to look back on their lives and think about the most wonderful moments they've experienced, they would probably list things like a marriage or the birth of a child or a grandchild. Things that can be extremely stressful. But the nostalgic reactions focus on the eustress, the intense joy associated with momentous life events, even though the logistics of planning a wedding ceremony or preparing for a new child can involve a fair amount of distress as well. One way to measure stress involves using questionnaires like the Holmes and Rahe stress scale, which includes distressing events like a marital separation, imprisonment, or the death of a close family member, as well as eustressing events such as a marriage, an outstanding personal achievement, a vacation, or Christmas. Stressful events can increase the risk of illness, in part by increasing cellular inflammation and suppressing the immune system, even if the stress is not experienced as a full-blown panic attack. The symptoms of severe distress include profuse sweating, dry mouth, cold, clammy hands, shortness of breath, muscle tension, upset stomach, a dazed look in the eyes, poor concentration, worse performance in an evaluative situation. Basically all of the symptoms that Cougar displays in the first few minutes of Top Gun. Severe distress can lead to serious consequences such as PTSD or post-traumatic stress disorder. Sustained distress can also cause major problems. Children who have experienced abuse or have frequently observed domestic disturbances actually become sensitized rather than desensitized to stressful events, meaning parental arguments become increasingly stressful for a child. The reason being, under sustained distress, a child's body releases cortisol, a hormone that promotes the release of glucose into the blood, allowing for a fight or flight response. Cortisol is not a huge problem in short spurts, but the sustained release of cortisol diminishes the ability of the HPA axis, the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, to regulate stress. And when the HPA axis is compromised, a child is at increased risk of abnormalities in their cognitive, emotional, relational, and even physical development. So the risk of harming the health and well-being of children is one reason why abusive coaching isn't a good idea. Also, coaching practice that elicit a fear response in children can be counterproductive because an influx of cortisol can hinder the myelination of neural pathways in the motor planning cortex associated with the motor skill being learned and promote the myelination of neural pathways between the amygdala and hippocampus, making the fight or flight response more efficient. So in plain English, this means instead of learning the motor skill, the kid just learns to hate their coach. Now, if you happen to be a coach who believes that what does not destroy them makes them stronger, you're probably getting pretty aroused right now. Malmo's classic 1959 definition of physiological arousal is this: physiological arousal consists of neural excitation on a continuum ranging from a comatose state to extreme excitement as might be manifested in a panic attack. Arousal can be measured via heart rate, galvanic skin response, and vagal tone. Sports psychology researchers have offered slightly different definitions of arousal, which sometimes blur the line between the concepts of stress, arousal, and anxiety. Dan Gould and Eileen Udry, for example, suggested that arousal is a multidimensional construct consisting of a physiological arousal component and a cognitive appraisal component, kind of like the idea of distress and eustress. And to confuse the issue further, this definition also draws in anxiety. The concept of anxiety was first explored by existential philosophers like Blaise Pascal, Soren Kierkegaard, and Henry David Thoreau, who were concerned with what it means to be an individual and what it means to exist. And the word anxiety is derived from the German and Danish word angst, meaning dread or fear, but not a traditional meaning of fear, which might be occasioned by the possibility of a threat, like the sight of a snarling bobcat, but a less tangible fear, the possibility of possibilities. Soren Kierkegaard explored the idea that the freedom of choice that we have as individuals can be a source of joy and a source of terror, because Kierkegaard concluded, ultimately everyone is alone, utterly alone, alone before God. So anxiety is different than fear because anxiety requires higher order thinking. An infant can experience fear in response to natural cues to danger, such as an angry facial expression or vocal tone, but an infant cannot experience anxiety, at least not in the Kierkegaardian sense of the word. So you might think of anxiety as high IQ fear, or fear with questionable validity. So let me see if I can redeem a confusing mess of terminology by suggesting one way to help athletes deal with a confusing mess of feelings during a competition. Having precise definitions of scientific terms is critically important to sport and exercise research, but definitions aren't always as important to the practice of sports psychology. When working with an athlete or team, it really doesn't matter whether we call it stress, arousal, anxiety, excitement, or butterflies. The experience is what it is. To draw on Shakespeare, a rose by any other name would smell so sweet. So let's think about competing under pressure and how athletes might experience these feelings. Some athletes approach competitive situations as if they were suddenly asked to defuse a time bomb. So imagine what that experience would be like. The time bomb would be an actual threat, and hopefully you'd be prepared. If you didn't succeed, you wouldn't get another opportunity, and a bad result would be terminal. So the outcome would be gravely important. You would understandably interpret the bomb as threatening, and you might wonder, what if I screw up? You might feel a sense of urgency, and success would bring relief. But you'd probably want the experience to end as soon as possible. Now imagine how you might perform in your sport if you experienced the competition as if you were defusing a time bomb. But now let's think of a different experience, a first date. And not a blind date or some sort of eHarmony situation, a first date with that acquaintance you've been waiting to get to know so thoroughly that you've lost sleep. So imagine what the experience of a first date would be like. Probably pretty exciting. And you'd probably be over-prepared, if anything, having taken 2 or 3 showers. If the date didn't go well, there would be other opportunities down the road. So a bad result would be disappointing but temporary. Before the date, you might think, I can't wait to do this. And if the date went well, the experience would be thrilling. You might be so caught up in the process to think of an outcome or a second date, and you probably wouldn't want that date to end. So now imagine how you might perform in your sport if you experience the competition as if you were going out on an exciting first date. And notice that both of these scenarios, the time bomb and the first date, are open to interpretation. It is theoretically possible that someone could interpret the experience of diffusing a time bomb as exciting. And it's also quite possible that someone could interpret the experience of going on a first date as threatening. But we can control our interpretations if we choose to do so. For many of us, very few of the things in life we experience as threats are actually threatening. People don't get prescriptions for pharmaceuticals because they are constantly threatened by snarling bobcats or frequently asked to defuse time bombs. Before and during important events, you're bound to feel something. And those feelings, however strong they may be, aren't necessarily a bad thing. But for most people, approaching a performance as if it's a first date rather than diffusing a time bomb is going to put them in a better state of mind to perform at their best. At least that's what I told the sophomores and juniors on the basketball team who won state later that year. And it probably had nothing to do with our little cognitive reinterpretation, but the reframing exercise apparently didn't hurt. So the next time you start to experience that fear, anxiety, excitement, butterflies, whatever you want to call it, remember that it's a first date. Be inspired by the fact that you will never have another October 1st, 2014 or October 21st, 2015 or whatever date your performance is on. So enjoy every first date, but don't be home too late.